Good morning. Nope. Is it not working? All right. Let's try that again. Good morning. Good to see all of y'all this morning. Good fellowship going on. It's time for that to stop. Okay. As we get started with our class this morning, I have a question for those of you who have ever tried cooking or baking or anything like that. Okay. Um, Now, even whether you're a great cook or a terrible cook, I have a feeling that there are some stories. Have you ever tried to bake something or cook something and you left out one ingredient that was a crucial ingredient and it was disastrous? Anybody want to share that story? Okay. Oh, cupcakes without sugar probably don't taste very good. That is a critical ingredient. You have one? Crunchy pasta. Yeah. Yeah, water is an important ingredient for pasta for sure. Yeah, crunchy pasta. Ooh, ooh, yes. Okay. Oh, oh, salt instead of sugar in a pie. Yeah, it looks great, but the taste. Oh no. Yeah, I don't know if how many of y'all watched when Jackson made the video of him making the cakes. You know, first time he'd ever tried to bake a cake, and I hadn't watched the video, but I had walked in after he had stopped filming and everything, and he said, "Don't eat that. It's nasty." And I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "I kind of want to try it now." And so I took a little bite, and I was like, "Ooh, wow, this is gross." I mean, this is even someone who's not a professional chef, can make a cake that might be okay, but this wasn't even okay. This was gross, and I thought, man, I don't understand what this is. So then later we watched the video, and sure enough, we're Dana and I are convinced that he put salt instead of sugar in the cake as he was baking it, and so that's gross. Uh, so we know what it's like to make that mistake. Just one ingredient can make all the difference, can it? Just one mistake, one left out ingredient, or maybe even one added ingredient that wasn't the right one can make a big difference. Well, we're coming to a period of time in our study where the nation of Israel is not particularly unified. They are kind of operating more as 12 tribes that are kind of independent from each other. But during this period of time, there is a growing threat coming from the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, we're at the height of the Iron Age. And the Philistines had taken over the iron industry, I guess. They'd cornered the market, you might say. What they did was they actually, in their culture, they made it illegal for anyone who was not a Philistine to either own or be able to create or work with iron utensils and weapons and those sorts of things. So people like the Israelites and others around them were forced to continue using things of lesser strength, like copper. And the other thing that we see happening is in the first few chapters of the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel that is, we see that the Philistines begin to really try to push their way further and further into Israel and take over more and more cities. We read of multiple attacks on cities within Israel by the Philistines. In fact, there's one occasion in which they were able to attack Shiloh. Now, what was significant about the city of Shiloh? What was kept in Shiloh? You remember? The Ark of the Covenant was kept in Shiloh, and they took the Ark of the Covenant. Now, turned out to be a mistake. Bad things happened to the Philistines as a result, and they gave it back. They said, "Thank you for taking this back." But this is happening at an increasing level. The Philistine threat is growing and growing, and all of this may very well have had an influence on why the people came to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And if you want to turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 8, I want you to look briefly there and notice, what is it that the people of Israel say that they need? A king. They are determined that they need a king. A king who is going to be able to help them fight their battles. A king who is going to kind of unite the nation and be able to lead them. A king who may be able to help them defeat the Philistines. You know, all of these kinds of things were probably a part of the mindset of what was going on when they came to Samuel and said, "We've got to have a king. We've got to have one person who's going to really lead the way, lead the charge." Now, Samuel tries to warn them, basically. He tries to warn them about all the negatives that come along with having a king. The fact that he's going to take taxes from you. He's going to take your sons and your daughters and put them in service in different ways. And that may not be what you really want, but they said, "No, we've got to have a king." And who is it that's chosen by God to be the first king of Israel? Saul, right. Saul is chosen as the first king of Israel. But when we study the life of Saul, I think most of the time we focus on the negatives, which there are a lot of. Okay, so that's maybe why we do that. It's easy to do, right? He was certainly a flawed man, a flawed leader. But don't forget, God chose him. God chose Saul. This was not the people's choice. This was God's choice. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is almost immediately after Saul is chosen to be king, you know, first he's anointed, and then he's presented to the people, and then it's kind of it becomes official right around chapter 10 of 1 Samuel. And then in chapter 11, I want you to notice something. This is just after Saul has kind of been confirmed as the man who is going to be the king of Israel. In 1 Samuel chapter 11, the Ammonites besiege the city of Jabesh-Gilead. And the people of the city, don't know what to do. They have no way of fighting off the Ammonites. And so they agree with the Ammonites. They kind of make this treaty. They say, if in a week we can't get anybody to come and rescue us, then we will concede and let you take over. And so the Ammonites say, sounds good to us. The people of Jabesh Gilead send out word throughout Israel asking for help. And at first, it seems like nobody's interested. And again, I think this kind of points to how disjointed the nation of Israel was at that time. You know, that's not our problem. That's way over in Jabesh Gilead. Well, Saul hears about what is going on, and he is distraught. And it says that he has just come in with his oxen. And so he takes those oxen and he kills them right there on the spot, cuts them into pieces, and sends them all around Israel. And the message that he sends with these pieces of oxen is, if you are not willing to come and help your brothers, if you're not willing to come and help defend other members of this nation of Israel, then this is what's going to happen to all of your oxen. All right? Well, the message works. He ends up getting 330,000 men to come and fight. And Saul leads those 330,000 up against the Ammonites, and it's a great victory. After this, at the end of chapter 11, you'll see that there is a huge celebration. And there's sacrifices that are made to God, celebrating God's power. There's peace offerings made to God. But really, even Samuel himself says, let's go to Gilgal and let's celebrate the fact that Saul was able to lead us the way that he was. Let's celebrate this unique occasion in which the nation of Israel now has been unified in a way that it had not been unified before. And this unifying power of Saul's is something that I don't think was ever forgotten by the people of Israel. Even when he's going through some bizarre times in his life, when he seems just absolutely crazy in some of the thought processes he has, the people of Israel continue to recognize him as this great, great leader of their nation. So much so that when you come to 1 Samuel 31 and the end of Saul's life, what you'll read is that there are several men who risk their lives sneaking into the Philistine camp in the middle of the night to take Saul's body so that they can bring it back to Israel and have a proper burial for their king. Saul was flawed for sure, but Saul had an incredible impact on the nation of Israel as their first king. He unified them in a way that was just very needed for them to be able to continue as a nation rather than as these 12 tribes. Now, that being said, we can't ignore his flaws, right? We can't possibly study Saul without talking about some of the challenges that occurred in his life. And what I really want us to look at are two key incidents in which Saul made some pretty big mistakes. The first is in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel. If you want to turn over there, once again we find they're going up against the Philistines, and we're going to start reading with verse 8 of 1 Samuel 13. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings," and he offered the burnt offering. Pause. Who is allowed to make burnt offerings to God? The priests, and nobody else. All right, let's keep reading. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, wouldn't you know it, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." So here, what is Saul's mistake here? Disobedience, right? Why does he do this? I mean, he says that he had to force himself to do it. But what's the real reason? He was desperate. He was desperate, and he was not willing to continue to wait. He was not willing to wait on God. Samuel was delayed for whatever reason, and he didn't trust God enough to wait to do things the right way. What we see happening here is Saul mostly obeys God here, right? He is fighting for the people of God. He is eager to have God's blessing on this battle, and he wants this sacrifice made to God. All those are good things. But he doesn't trust God enough for that last little key ingredient, which is just to wait to do it the right way. And because of that, Samuel says, God has taken his kingdom away from you. Let's turn over a couple more chapters to chapter 15. Chapter 15, starting with verse 1. And Samuel said to Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now, go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So Saul summoned the people and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the valley. Then Saul said to the Kenites, Go Go down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them. For you showed kindness to all the people of Israel when they came up out of Egypt. So the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites, and Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. So what did Saul decide to keep? All the good stuff, right? Hey, God says destroy everything. It's easy to destroy the stuff you don't want, right? But he saw that there were some things there that could benefit him. And so he keeps it. Once again, what we're seeing in Saul is someone who is willing to obey to a point. But he's not quite willing to take that last step. That's not what God asked for him to do, though. And so, again, one of the messages that Samuel brings to him when Samuel confronts him and he hears the bleating of the sheep, one of the things he reminds Saul is that God has taken this kingdom away from you because of your partial obedience, because you have mostly obeyed God without completely obeying him. Now, who is the man after God's own heart that was mentioned earlier that God has found to replace Saul? David, right? The interesting thing about David and Saul's relationship is that at first it's okay. You know, Saul is glad to have David there to defeat Goliath. Saul is glad to have to give his own daughter to David as his wife. But then things begin to change when Saul realizes that David's popularity is increasing even beyond his own. And Saul is so insecure that he sees David as a threat. And he focuses so much on defeating David and getting rid of David that he loses sight of what he should be doing as the king of a nation. And what we see happen is even after the Philistines have been soundly defeated, remember, by David and the Israelite army in the incident with Goliath. They were defeated. By the time we get through the saga that takes place with this constant turmoil as Saul chases after David and tries to kill him on multiple occasions, and he's so focused on David, what happens is the Philistine nation has once again risen to power. They've been allowed to kind of once again become a threat to the nation of Israel. And in the last 3-4 chapters of 1 Samuel, what you see is a completely different version of Saul. Remember in chapter 11, Saul was this unifying force in the nation of Israel. He is the king that they needed, the king that they were looking for, and he was celebrated because of it. You come to these last few chapters of 1 Samuel, and what you read is a king in Saul who has no idea what he's doing. He's He's so unprepared for this battle. And he's so insecure, he's not sure what to do. He has no battle plan. And in fact, he goes and uses a medium, which was entirely counter to the will of God, to try and resurrect Samuel as an advisor, try and figure out what he ought to do. And we see this unprepared, insecure man trying to defeat the Philistines, and it doesn't work. He's defeated at Gilboa. I think the lesson for us in studying the life of Saul is this. The song that we sing says, trust and what? Obey. Do you know how linked those two are? Trust and obedience. They go hand in hand. Saul was insecure and uncertain and did not trust God to do what he says he was going to do. He did not trust God enough to wait on God's timing. He didn't trust God enough to completely obey when the time came. And because of that, Saul ends up being less of a king than he really could have been. I mean, if he had continued to put his trust in God, I think we would have read more and more and more accounts like chapter 11, where he rallied everybody together and helped the nation of Israel to grow and to become the powerful nation that they could have been. But that's just not the Saul we see by the time we get to the end of his life. Obedience to God is the result of trusting God's will more than our own. Obedience to God is the result of trusting God's timing, not ours. Trusting God's mission, not our own. Trust and obey. They go hand in hand. And in Saul's life, what we see is someone who didn't trust God enough to obey him. Any other thoughts this morning on the life of Saul? All right, then let's have a word of prayer together and we'll be done with our class this morning. Our Holy Father in heaven, we thank you so much. We thank you for loving us. We thank you for your compassion and your grace. We know, Lord, that we fall short, and sometimes we are insecure like Saul, and we are uncertain like Saul. But Lord, we pray that you will help us to trust you enough to obey you completely. Help us to put our trust and our faith in you each day as we face the challenges of this life, as we endure the hardships of this life. Lord, help us to continue to put our faith and our trust in you. We thank you so much for Jesus. We thank you so much for his sacrifice for our sins. And it's in Jesus'